The majlis had fallen into a silence that seemed to press against the walls. The faint crackle of the incense burner was the only sound, releasing slow ribbons of oud smoke that curled toward the high, shadowed ceiling. The lamps burned low, their amber light catching on the gilded patterns of the arches and sending long shadows stretching over the marble floor. Rashid stood near the far end of the thick carpet, his figure rigid, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that had silenced ministers and foreign dignitaries alike. But tonight his gaze was not that of a ruler, it was that of a father, sharpened by uncertainty. Noor stood at the threshold, framed by the carved doorway, the space between them taut with something that felt older than the moment. As if they were continuing an argument neither had ever spoken aloud. His tone was even, but the measured calm barely concealed the edge beneath. Noor's voice was steady, but there was a quiet pulse of exhaustion in it. He was playing in the courtyard near the fountain. The word was repeated as if it were a stone he weighed in his palm, testing its shape. Doctor, the embroidered linen in her hands had dried in places, stiff with blood. Her grip tightened as though holding onto it gave her anchor. I have told you all I know, Your Highness. I found him hurt. The title landed between them like a wall. Rashid had heard it spoken 1,000 times, but tonight it sounded less like respect and more like distance. Hana, seated to Rashid's right, adjusted the folds of her abaya. Her voice was low but carried the weight of unchallengeable certainty. You must act carefully, Rashid. The ministry will be involved. I am aware, he said, without turning toward her. His eyes stayed fixed on Noor, searching her expression for cracks that might betray a lie, or something else he could not name. No anger laced his voice, yet the words carried the finality of a gate being shut. Noor's head dipped slightly in acknowledgement. Her steps as she left were quiet, but the faint whisper of her abaya against the marble seemed to linger in the air long after she had gone. That night, the palace lay in its own silence. The outer courtyard slept under the pale arc of the crescent moon. The marble of the inner gardens still held the warmth of the day, giving off a faint scent of sun-baked stone. From the open windows of Zayd's chamber came the murmur of the fountains, each drop of water catching a glint of moonlight before disappearing into the basin below. Inside, Zayd lay curled beneath a light blanket, his small frame outlined in the silver glow from the window. His eyes were open, reflecting the night sky. He traced the edge of the sheet with his fingers, a small, restless movement, as though it could keep the thoughts in his head from spilling out. The door creaked, and Rashid's tall figure appeared. He stepped inside, the soft rustle of his thobe breaking the quiet. He sat at the edge of the bed, his presence filling the space without crowding it. You should be sleeping, he said, but the words lacked reproach. Zayd hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. The quiet between them deepened. I tripped on the steps by the fountain, the boy said, eyes shining in the low light. The words struck something raw in Rashid. He realized that the boy's fear had not been of punishment, but of the stern, unreadable mask he wore even at home. Zayd's small hand slid into his. She helped me, Baba. She stopped the bleeding. She stayed with me until you came. Rashid looked at his son for a long moment, studying the sincerity in his young eyes. Beyond the window, the desert wind shifted, carrying with it a faint fragrance of jasmine from the gardens, delicate but impossible to ignore. It was the same scent that had clung to Noor's presence earlier that night. He did not answer immediately. Some truths, he knew, were not meant to be rushed into words. Outside, the fountains kept whispering, the desert kept breathing, and the crescent moon hung silently above them, watching. The majlis had fallen into a suffocating quiet, the kind that turns every breath into an intrusion. Lantern light lay in soft pools over the carpet, catching in the gold thread and making it glint like quiet embers. Rashid stood rigid at the far end, the controlled stillness of a man who knows that one stray word can change the shape of a life. Noor remained near the threshold, framed by carved wood and shadow, her hands still stained where the linen had pressed against Zayd's skin. His voice came out even, but the evenness felt like a blade laid flat. Yes, she answered, not defiant, not timid, merely exact. He was playing by the courtyard fountain. Doctor, he watched for the flinch that would betray a lie. There was none. I have told you the truth, Your Highness. I found him hurt. From the seating along the wall, Hana shifted, her abaya whispering hush against marble. Rashid, the ministry will be informed by morning. I will act, he said, eyes still on Noor. The words landed between them like a gate swung shut. Noor inclined her head. No protest, no pleading. Only the quiet discipline of someone who has learned that dignity is sometimes the only shelter left. She turned and walked out. The scent of oud lifted in her wake and then was gone. The Majlis held the silence a moment longer. Hana's voice came low, steady, practiced. You protected the palace. Rashid did not answer. Something in him resisted the symmetry of that sentence. He dismissed the attendants and stood alone for a heartbeat, listening to the distant fountains. They sounded unchanged, as if the water refused to take sides. In the corridor beyond the Majlis, Noor moved with careful steps, conscious of eyes that pretended not to follow her. At a corner where the servants' passage met the family hall, a small wooden falcon lay on its side, the wing chipped, Zaid's toy, abandoned in the scramble of fear. She crouched and set it upright on a low console, her fingers lingering for a breath as if the worn wood might remember gentler hours. Then she continued down toward the servants' wing, the light thinning, the floor colder underfoot. Her room was spare, a narrow bed, a low chest, a brass bowl polished bright from habit, a small string of prayer beads looped over a nail. She rinsed the linen at the basin. Pink bled into the water, then paled, then cleared. The cloth came clean, but the memory did not. She wrung it carefully and hung it by the shutter to dry. For a long while she stood without moving, watching the cloth stir in the faint breeze. The palace had a way of keeping its own weather. In its currents, stories curled and flew faster than truth. Back in the family wing, Rashid walked the length of the long gallery that overlooked the inner garden. The mashrabia screens patterned the moonlight across his path like latticework shadows. He tried to order the day into facts. A wound, a cloth, a doctor's assessment, a protocol. But the line refused to be straight. It bent around Zaid's averted eyes in the car window, around the steadiness in Noor's voice, around the shape of the word afraid when he pictured his son. Hana's footfall joined his. They will ask in the morning what you plan to do, she said without preamble. Her gaze sharpened. You cannot be seen to favor a servant over the appearance of safety. He turned to her then, not unkindly. And what if honor requires patience? Hana held his eyes a long second. She had grown up in these halls too. She knew how swiftly appearances hardened into law. Then show them truth, she said. She inclined her head and left him with the latticework shadows. When the hour grew thin, Rashid entered his son's chamber. The room was muted silver, the moon pooling on the tiled floor. Zaid lay small and tight under the light blanket, his lashes dark on his cheek. A child's breath can be loud when the night holds its own. Rashid sat carefully at the edge of the bed. You should be sleeping, he said, and even his whisper felt heavy. The words came as a tremor, but they did not stumble. A pause gathered itself between them. Zaid swallowed. I was scared you'd be angry. Rashid felt the sentence open a door he had not known was closed. He understood, in the slow ache of the moment, that authority worn too long without softness can turn into a mask even at home. The anger his son had read was not anger at Zaid at all. It was the old storm that had never quite left him, the day his wife's hand went slack in his. Zaid's small fingers found his. She helped me. She stayed with me till you came. He did not answer right away. Children are impatient with silence. They think it means the grown world is balancing on something breakable. Yet Rashid let the silence fill, not to frighten the boy, but to be honest with it. Outside, the fountains stitched silver threads into the night. The jasmine at the garden edge released its fragrance by degrees, as if it trusted the darkness to carry it further. Sleep, he said at last, smoothing Zaid's hair back. The boy's hand softened in his palm. Breathing evened, deepened. The room settled around that rhythm. Rashid left the chamber and walked out to the terrace above the inner courtyard. The night air held a warm edge. The crescent moon rested light as a cuff of silver on the dome beyond. Somewhere farther off, a falcon cried once, the sound clean and solitary. He leaned on the cool stone and let the palace speak in its older language. Water over stone, leaf against leaf. The hush of corridors that had carried confessions and decrees long before his lifetime. He thought of Noor in her small room rinsing a cloth. He thought of the wooden falcon set upright again, and the way her hand might have hovered a second longer than necessary. He thought of Hana's warning, and the council's inevitable appetite for conclusions. Then he thought of Zaid, turning fear into a lie to protect himself from a father's shadow. There are faults that only love can reveal, and they do not absolve the one who made them. In the servants' wing, not far from sleep, Noor sat on the edge of her bed, counting prayer beads without moving her lips. She did not ask the night for vindication, only for steadiness. Outside her window, the palace fountains were a softer sound, as if distance thinned them to a thread, but the thread held. On the sill, the cloth she had washed lifted, fell, lifted, a small, stubborn sail. Near dawn, the palace changed color. The moon paled. The sky took on a quiet pewter before deciding toward gold. In the kitchen courtyard, first fires snapped to life, and the air tasted briefly of smoke and cardamom together. Servants crossed paths with lowered voices, their errands beginning to stitch the day. Some eyes turned toward the family hall, and then away again, the etiquette of looking without seeming to look. Rashid remained on the terrace until the seam of the horizon broke into light. He had not prayed for a sign, yet the morning arrived with a clarity that felt like one. Appearances were not truth. Fear was not proof. A boy had asked him to listen. A woman had refused to bow her head beneath a lie. If honor meant anything under a God who sees what men pretend not to, it would have to mean the courage to stand in the opening the night had made. He turned from the balustrade, steps down the corridor, purposeful, measured. Hana again, or perhaps an attendant. He would know in a moment. Before the day gathered its councils and protocols, before the ministry's name pressed into conversation like a seal, he would go first to the place where the rumor would not enter, his son's room, and then the small door off the servants' passage where a pale abaya might be folded on a chair and a clean cloth hung to dry. The palace breathed in. Morning gold touched the mosaic walls and set the patterns alight. Somewhere in the garden, a falcon took the air and rode the first warm current. Rashid walked toward the family wing with the understanding that would carry him into the day. The truth had spoken softly in the night, and he would not pretend he had not heard it. The dawn over Dubai was slow in its unveiling, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile quiet the night had left behind. The sky wore a pale, silvery sheen before yielding to muted gold, and in that soft light, the domes of Kareem Palace glowed like half-buried treasures. From the upper terraces, the city was a scattering of glass and light across the horizon, the desert behind it, still shrouded in night's cool breath. Inside the palace walls, the air carried a different weight, one made not of heat or humidity, but of unspoken questions. The soundscape was muted, the careful tread of servants in soft slippers, the discreet clink of silver trays in the kitchens, and somewhere in the depths, the faint hum of water running through ancient stone channels to feed the courtyard fountains. In the servants' wing, rumor had already taken root and begun to flower. Voices spoke in quick bursts before falling silent at the sound of footsteps. Some claimed they had seen Noor led away from the family hall by the guards. Others swore the boy's injury had been from a fall far worse than admitted. The truth, like a pearl deep within an oyster, was hidden beneath layers no one dared to pry open too quickly. In the family wing, Sheikh Rashid sat in his private study, a room designed for both contemplation and command. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound histories, the kind whose spines had been darkened by years of handling. Morning sunlight filtered through the intricate mashrabia lattice, breaking into shifting, honeyed patterns on the marble floor. On his desk, a porcelain cup of kahwa sat cooling, the fragrant steam curling upward, only to vanish in the still air. He had not touched it. The weight of the night still pressed on him. Each time his mind circled back to Zaid's quiet voice in the dark, it collided with the image of Noor in the majlis, holding her ground beneath accusation. And beyond that, Hana's steady insistence that appearances, not private truths, would decide the course of the day. A sharp knock at the door. "Enter," Rashid said. His tone clipped. Hana stepped inside, her abaya flowing in the lamplight like black silk poured over stone. She carried no scrolls, no papers, only the authority of her voice. "The council is assembled," she said. "They expect you within the hour." Her words were precise, each one set down like a stepping stone toward an inevitable conclusion. Rashid rose from his desk, adjusting the fall of his bisht, the gold embroidery catching the first gleam of morning. The council chamber was not the grand ceremonial majlis, but it held more weight. The walls were lined with carved cedar panels, the scent of their polish mingling faintly with cardamom and mint. Cushions of deep emerald ringed the space, low tables set with silver trays of dates, figs, and small porcelain cups already filled with steaming coffee. Here, the elders of the Al-Kareem family gathered, 6 in all, each a custodian of the palace's history, each measuring the future against the ledger of the past. The air was cooler here, but heavy with the unspoken rule that in this room, hesitation could cost more than the truth itself. She was found alone with the boy, Malik began. His voice graveled with the weight of both years and certainty. The wound was fresh. The physician herself questioned the cause. A second elder, younger but no less severe, leaned forward, his ringed hands resting on his knees. Honor demands clarity. If harm came under her care, removal is not only justified, it is necessary. Rashid listened without shifting his gaze. Outwardly, he was the very image of measured composure, but inside, each word landed against the memory of Zaid's plea like a dull strike against stone. He allowed the silence to grow a moment longer before answering. "She has served without fault until now," he said evenly. And the boy himself. His eyes narrowed slightly, the pause deliberate. Malik's brows drew together. "Children protect those they like." "Nor is suspicion proof," Rashid replied. Anna's gaze met his across the circle. Her look sharpened into something that was both warning and challenge. She did not speak, but the meaning was clear. The council's patience was not infinite. Rashid allowed another pause before delivering his verdict. "Until the ministry completes its inquiry, Noor Hassan will remain in service, but confined to quarters outside the family wing." The words settled in the room like a drop of ink into water, not loud, but impossible to pull back. There was a subtle shift in the elders' postures, some leaning away, others glancing to one another as if recalculating the ground they stood on. Malik's lips pressed into a line so thin it was almost invisible, but no one spoke against the decision. Not yet. Noor's quarters lay in the farthest corner of the servants' wing, beyond the storerooms and the narrow staircase to the roof. Her room held no more than what duty allowed: a low bed covered with a simple cotton spread, a cedar chest that carried the faint scent of lavender, a brass basin polished to a muted glow, and a single shelf lined with neatly folded linens. The arched window looked into the smaller inner courtyard, where the sound of a modest fountain whispered into the air. Since the council's decree, her existence had shrunk to measured footsteps and short breaths. Meals were left in silence, a tray on the floor outside her door, the quiet knock followed by retreating footsteps. The other attendants avoided lingering in her path, glancing only once before quickly looking away. It was not hostility, but something colder, the refusal to be associated with what might soon be condemned. The mornings were worst. She would hear the palace coming alive, the muffled steps in the galleries, the clink of china in the kitchens, the echo of laughter in the family wing, all sounds from which she was now cut off. She would sit at the edge of her bed with her prayer beads coiled in her palm, the smoothness of each bead grounding her in something older than the palace, older than fear. Through the window, the courtyard pigeons came and went, dipping their heads to drink, scattering in bursts of silver gray when startled by a gardener's broom. When she ventured to fetch water from the kitchens, conversation always thinned. That afternoon, as she stepped in, the air was warm with the scent of cinnamon, cardamom, and freshly baked bread. 2 attendants were speaking in low voices near the spice shelves. "They say the ministry will send an inspector tomorrow," one murmured. "Tomorrow? If they find something." The moment Noor's shadow fell across the threshold, the words dissolved. Copper pots clanged needlessly. Jars were rearranged on the shelves. She filled her jug without speaking, aware of the way they didn't meet her gaze. The day passed slowly, the sunlight moving across the mosaic floors like liquid gold. By late afternoon, the palace seemed suspended between stillness and anticipation, as though the walls themselves were listening. Noor made her way along the colonnade toward the linen room, her soft-soled steps barely touching the tiles. She kept her head lowered, though her eyes traced every movement in the periphery, the tilt of a guard's head, the way a servant's pace slowed before quickening again. Halfway down, a figure blocked the end of the hall. Sheikh Rashid stood in conversation with a guard, his deep voice carrying in controlled, measured tones. The guard bowed and withdrew, leaving only the two of them in the expanse of light and shadow. The corridor between them was framed by tall arches opening to the courtyard, where late sunlight poured in at an angle, gilding the floor in shifting patterns. Noor's pulse rose, but her pace did not change. Rashid took a step forward, his bisht trailing behind him like a shadow in motion. "You have kept to your quarters," he said when the distance had narrowed enough, his voice unreadable. "As instructed, Your Highness," she answered, her tone carefully balanced, neither submissive nor challenging. His gaze was steady, searching. "The ministry's review will begin soon." Her eyes held his. Something flickered in his expression, gone too quickly to name. He inclined his head a fraction, the gesture formal yet weighted, and stepped past her. As he passed, the scent of oud mingled with the faint sharpness of desert air clung between them. Her own breath caught, not from fear, but from the strange knowledge that something in him had heard her. Rashid did not return to his study. Instead, he walked the outer arcade that circled the courtyard, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble. The fountains murmured in the late light, and the shadow of a date palm swayed across the mosaic floor. He found himself thinking of the stillness in Noor's gaze, not the stillness of someone defeated, but of someone anchored in a truth they would not abandon. From one of the high arches, he looked out toward the horizon where the city's towers stood against the fading sky. He knew the council would press again, and Hana would urge decisiveness. Yet the memory of Zaid's voice in the darkness, "She helped me, she stayed until you came," had become harder to set aside. The muezzin's call rose from the city beyond, carried on the warm breeze. Rashid closed his eyes briefly, letting the cadence settle into him. There would be time enough for verdicts. But tonight, the walls of the palace held more than suspicion. They held a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud. The ministry's work began without flourish, slipping into the palace's veins like water into the cracks of old stone. Quiet, patient, and inevitable. There were no loud orders, no hurried footsteps, only a subtle shift in the air, the kind one feels before the wind changes. The inspectors moved through the corridors with an unhurried precision, their white gutras and dark robes absorbing the soft light that filtered from the high windows. Servants stepped aside when they passed, not from command, but from the unspoken knowledge that to be in their way was to be remembered. Their first hours were spent far from the family wing, in a side chamber off the main courtyard that had been stripped of its usual furnishings. Now, a long walnut table stretched beneath the latticed windows, the sun spilling across its polished surface in narrow golden bands. Two inspectors sat at one end, their posture composed, hands resting lightly on the table's edge, speaking in voices so even that they seemed designed to wear down the will of those they questioned. Between them, a silver tray bore small porcelain cups of coffee that cooled untouched, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of sandalwood from the courtyard beyond. They began, as they always did, with those who could be approached without resistance, the attendants, the kitchen staff, the junior stewards, gathering the smallest details, weaving them into threads that might later ensnare those of higher rank. The questions were neither aggressive nor indulgent, each delivered with a measured pause in which the scribe's reed pen scratched steadily, recording without commentary. Some servants spoke quickly, their eyes fixed on the floor, their answers trimmed to the barest facts. Others leaned forward, speaking in low, careful tones, as if they might gain favor by being remembered for a detail, however small, that no one else had offered. When Noor's name was finally called near midday, she entered the chamber without haste, her steps measured, her expression composed. The pale folds of her abaya softened the severity of the wood-paneled walls, and the light from the lattice caught faint glints along the line of her cheekbone. She greeted them with the formal "Assalamu alaikum," her voice carrying the evenness of someone who had decided long before she crossed the threshold that she would not bend to the weight of the room. The lead inspector, a man whose eyes seemed to assess not only her words but the silences between them, began. Her reply was stripped of everything except the sequence of truth as she had lived it. The wet stone steps by the courtyard fountain, the sudden slip, the sound of his fall, the sharp cut that followed, and the linen she had pressed to stem the bleeding. She did not reach for embellishment nor for apology. Her tone was level, her sentences shaped to fit the space without spilling into it. The inspector's gaze did not shift from hers. You understand the difficulty of your position. Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. My word is the truth. The scribe's pen paused for the briefest instant before continuing, as if it too had absorbed the weight of the words. Zaid's questioning took place in another chamber, smaller, warmer, its single tall window opening toward the gardens, where the breeze carried the scent of jasmine and wet earth. Rashid stood behind his son's chair, his shadow long against the tiled floor, his presence an unspoken barrier between the boy and the men across the table. "Tell me what happened at the fountain," the inspector said, his tone deliberately gentle, the kind used to coax truth from hesitant voices. "I slipped," Zaid replied, his hands twisting together in his lap. The boy's gaze flickered to his father, then dropped again. Rashid's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder, not heavy but steady, a silent anchor in a moment that could easily have turned into something else. The inspector wrote slowly, each stroke of the pen deliberate, his face unreadable. Later, Rashid found Hana in the inner garden, standing beside the fountain whose surface mirrored the fading afternoon light in rippling shards. The air was thick with the fragrance of jasmine, and the sound of falling water filled the pauses between their words. "They will not close this quickly," Hana said, her eyes following a petal as it drifted into the water's spiral. Rashid's gaze held hers, steady and unblinking. "You mean to interfere?" she said, though her voice carried more curiosity than reproach. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of stillness in which decisions take root, slow, invisible at first, but certain to alter the shape of what comes next. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, the call to prayer rose into the air, its long measured notes stretching toward the sky. Rashid did not look away from Hana, but his eyes seemed to hold a distance beyond her, as if he could already see the path he intended to take. By the next morning, the palace was no longer merely holding its breath. It was breathing in short, careful rhythms, as though each corridor anticipated the next footstep, each door the sound of an unexpected knock. The ministry's arrival had not yet been made visible, but its shadow was already inside the walls. Conversations were shorter, glances lasted longer, and silences stretched thin, taut with meaning. From his study balcony, Sheikh Rashid could see the great bronze gates far in the distance, their massive panels reflecting the sun until they became almost blinding. Beyond them, the desert shimmered faintly in the morning heat, a pale expanse where time seemed to move differently. Closer in the main courtyard, the royal guard stood doubled in number, spears catching the light in sharp, deliberate flashes. On the upper terraces, the palace falcons were being exercised, their wings slicing the air in elegant arcs before returning to their handlers' leather-clad hands. It was an ordinary routine, yet today it looked more like a performance, as if even the birds understood they were being watched. Inside the servants' wing, Noor was already awake long before the call to prayer. She had learned in these last days that the only time she could move without attracting eyes was in the soft blue before dawn, when the palace lay between dreams and duty. She filled her brass jug at the courtyard fountain, its water cool against her palms, and for a moment she stood there, letting the mist rise to her face. It smelled faintly of stone, jasmine, and the quiet that only comes before sunrise. Her life since the council's decree had narrowed into a kind of measured solitude. She spoke little, moved only when necessary, and counted her prayers not in haste, but bead by bead, each one a reminder that truth, once fixed, does not dissolve in silence. Still, the air around her had changed. In the kitchens, she caught fragments. The ministry asked for the physician's report. They will question the boy again. Best not to be seen speaking to her. The words were like drifting embers, small, glowing, and dangerous if they found dry ground. By mid-morning, Hana appeared in Rashid's study, without waiting for an attendant to announce her. She wore a bisht of deep green trimmed with fine gold, the color and style reserved for private counsel among the family. She moved as one accustomed to bringing decisions, not seeking them. "They will not wait much longer," she began, standing before his desk, as though the space between them were already a debating floor. Rashid leaned back, his hand resting on the carved armrest of the cedar chair. "Then they will begin," he said evenly. "It changes everything," Hana replied without hesitation. "The ministry is not here for truth. It is here for closure." His eyes lifted to hers. For a moment, her lips parted. though no words came immediately. When they did, they were sharpened to the precision of a blade. Then you are risking more than your own name. You are placing the family's standing and the palace's honor in the path of a scandal. It is not sentiment, Rashid said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Anna's gaze did not soften, but something in her posture shifted. The acknowledgement of a man she had known long enough to understand his stubbornness. She gave a single small nod and withdrew, leaving behind the scent of her jasmine perfume lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. The palace held still until early afternoon, when the sound of engines echoed through the outer courtyard. 3 black cars rolled in through the gates, their windows tinted, the ministry's gold crest glinting under the sun. Even the fountains seemed to quiet as the vehicles stopped before the main steps. From her small window in the servants' wing, Noor caught the reflection of light off the windshields and saw the blur of men stepping out, white gutras, dark robes, briefcases in hand. Their movements were measured, almost ceremonial, the way men carry themselves when they know they arrive with authority that cannot be denied. She let the curtain fall back into place. She had seen this pattern before, the methodical search of quarters, the discreet yet relentless questioning, the slow turning of stories until they no longer resembled the truth as it had been lived. Her own moment would come soon enough, and when it did, she would answer as she always had, without embellishment, without flinching. Somewhere else in the palace, Rashid was descending the grand staircase to meet the inspectors. His steps, usually silent, carried today, each one echoing against marble and tile as if announcing a meeting that would alter the air itself. The vast entrance hall was cool, shaded, its great chandelier catching the filtered daylight and breaking it into shards of crystal light that trembled faintly over the floor. As he reached the bottom step, the leading inspector inclined his head, not as a gesture of deference, but as one professional to another, a man who understood he had entered the territory of someone who could match him in presence, if not in position. The day had shifted. The walls of Kareem Palace had learned to hold secrets, but now they would be asked to speak. The ministry's work began without flourish, slipping into the palace's veins like water into the cracks of old stone. Quiet, patient, and inevitable. There were no loud orders, no hurried footsteps, only a subtle shift in the air, the kind one feels before the wind changes. The inspectors moved through the corridors with an unhurried precision, their white gutras and dark robes absorbing the soft light that filtered from the high windows. Servants stepped aside when they passed, not from command, but from the unspoken knowledge that to be in their way was to be remembered. Their first hours were spent far from the family wing, in a side chamber off the main courtyard that had been stripped of its usual furnishings. Now, a long walnut table stretched beneath the latticed windows, the sun spilling across its polished surface in narrow golden bands. 2 inspectors sat at one end, their posture composed, hands resting lightly on the table's edge, speaking in voices so even that they seemed designed to wear down the will of those they questioned. Between them, a silver tray bore small porcelain cups of coffee that cooled untouched, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of sandalwood from the courtyard beyond. They began, as they always did, with those who could be approached without resistance, the attendants, the kitchen staff, the junior stewards, gathering the smallest details, weaving them into threads that might later ensnare those of higher rank. The questions were neither aggressive nor indulgent, each delivered with a measured pause in which the scribe's reed pen scratched steadily, recording without commentary. Some servants spoke quickly, their eyes fixed on the floor, their answers trimmed to the barest facts. Others leaned forward, speaking in low, careful tones, as if they might gain favor by being remembered for a detail, however small, that no one else had offered. When Noor's name was finally called near midday, she entered the chamber without haste, her steps measured, her expression composed. The pale folds of her abaya softened the severity of the wood-paneled walls, and the light from the lattice caught faint glints along the line of her cheekbone. She greeted them with the formal "Assalamu alaikum," her voice carrying the evenness of someone who had decided long before she crossed the threshold that she would not bend to the weight of the room. The lead inspector, a man whose eyes seemed to assess not only her words but the silences between them, began. Her reply was stripped of everything except the sequence of truth as she had lived it. The wet stone steps by the courtyard fountain, the sudden slip, the sound of his fall, the sharp cut that followed, and the linen she had pressed to stem the bleeding. She did not reach for embellishment nor for apology. Her tone was level, her sentences shaped to fit the space without spilling into it. The inspector's gaze did not shift from hers. "You understand the difficulty of your position." Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. "My word is the truth." The scribe's pen paused for the briefest instant before continuing, as if it too had absorbed the weight of the words. Zaid's questioning took place in another chamber, smaller, warmer, its single tall window opening toward the gardens, where the breeze carried the scent of jasmine and wet earth. Rashid stood behind his son's chair, his shadow long against the tiled floor, his presence an unspoken barrier between the boy and the men across the table. "Tell me what happened at the fountain," the inspector said, his tone deliberately gentle, the kind used to coax truth from hesitant voices. "I slipped," Zaid replied, his hands twisting together in his lap. The boy's gaze flickered to his father, then dropped again. Rashid's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder, not heavy but steady, a silent anchor in a moment that could easily have turned into something else. The inspector wrote slowly, each stroke of the pen deliberate, his face unreadable. Later, Rashid found Hana in the inner garden, standing beside the fountain whose surface mirrored the fading afternoon light in rippling shards. The air was thick with the fragrance of jasmine, and the sound of falling water filled the pauses between their words. "They will not close this quickly," Hana said, her eyes following a petal as it drifted into the water's spiral. Rashid's gaze held hers, steady and unblinking. "You mean to interfere?" she said, though her voice carried more curiosity than reproach. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of stillness in which decisions take root, slow, invisible at first, but certain to alter the shape of what comes next. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, the call to prayer rose into the air, its long measured notes stretching toward the sky. Rashid did not look away from Hana, but his eyes seemed to hold a distance beyond her, as if he could already see the path he intended to take. The following day emerged in muted tones, the desert sun veiled by a fine layer of haze that lay over the horizon like silk gauze, softening the edges of towers and minarets. From the highest balconies, the city seemed to sleep beneath this pale shroud, its usual brilliance subdued, its colors turned to quiet shades of gold and ivory. Yet inside Kareem Palace, there was no softness, no yielding. The air moved with a listening stillness, as if the walls themselves understood that the hours ahead might alter the course of many fates. Rashid was awake long before the first call to prayer broke the silence. He moved through his private quarters without lighting a single lamp, letting the dim gray of pre-dawn guide him. The marble beneath his bare feet held the night's coolness, grounding him in each step. In the central courtyard of his chambers, the fountain whispered softly under the faint glow of hanging glass lanterns, their light reflected in the shifting surface of the water. The scent of night-blooming jasmine still clung to the air, mingling with the sharper trace of the desert wind that had slipped in through the open arches. He entered the private majlis, a room rarely used, reserved for moments when counsel had to be sought away from the reach of many ears. The walls were lined not with ornamental displays, but with shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes whose edges had frayed with use. The low table in the center held a silver dala of coffee, its steam curling slowly upward in the dimness, carrying the bitter fragrance of roasted beans. Hassan bin Tariq arrived before the horizon had begun to lighten. His footsteps in the marble corridor were slow but assured, the gait of a man who had never once needed to announce his presence. Older than Rashid by a decade, Hassan carried the quiet authority of someone whose influence was never spoken of openly, yet was felt wherever decisions were made. They greeted one another not with the effusive embrace of friends, but with the measured grip of men who had stood on the same side of unseen battles. Hassan settled into the cushion opposite, his dark bisht falling in clean folds around him. "They will push for a swift conclusion," he said without preamble, his voice deep but low. "Their report will lean toward removal." "Swift," Rashid repeated, as though tasting the word, "is often mistaken for clean." Hassan's eyes did not waver. "If you wish to stop it, you cannot rely on speeches in the council chamber." By the time the sun broke fully over the city, Rashid's quiet network had begun to stir. No letters left the palace walls. Ink left trails that could be followed, but envoys were dispatched under the pretext of routine errands, carrying words that would be spoken and then vanish like breath in the air. An invitation for tea in the home of an influential merchant. A request for the company of a minor dignitary whose opinions, when voiced in the right place, were worth more than official decrees. The moves seemed disconnected, but together they began to form the outline of a pattern. In the servants' wing, Noor felt the change without fully understanding it. The glances cast her way were no longer uniformly cold. Some lingered with a hint of calculation, as if those who had already condemned her were reconsidering whether such certainty was wise. The whispers had not ceased, but they carried a new note: hesitation, even curiosity. From her small window, she saw Rashid crossing the inner courtyard with Hassan. The sight should have meant little, a ruler in conversation with an advisor. Yet there was something in the alignment of their steps, in the slight forward angle of Rashid's head as Hassan spoke, that suggested a shared resolve. The morning light slid across the mosaic tiles in their path, gilding their shadows as they moved toward the north wing, where few without purpose were permitted to go. In the late afternoon, Rashid made his way to the stables. It was a place he visited rarely, and never without reason. The stablemaster, a man whose weathered skin bore the imprint of decades in the sun, bowed deeply before leading him down the long row of stalls. Arabian stallions shifted within, their dark eyes bright, their coats gleaming in the golden light. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of hay, oiled leather, and the warm, almost electric musk of the animals. He paused beside a gray mare whose mane was as pale as drifted sand, running his hand slowly down the strong curve of her neck. To any onlooker, it was the gesture of a master checking his stock. But when the stable master stepped away to adjust a bridle, a figure emerged from the shadows. A young man dressed plainly, carrying himself with the unassuming air of a servant. He approached without looking directly at Rashid and slipped a folded piece of parchment into the sheikh's hand. There was no seal, no address, only a single mark in the upper corner, a crescent moon drawn in ink so dark it absorbed the surrounding light. Rashid did not open it there. Instead, he slid it into the inner fold of his bisht, his face betraying nothing. He left the stables as he had entered, slowly, without glance or hurry, yet the air in the courtyard seemed subtly altered by the time he crossed it again, as though the delivery of that one silent message had shifted something unseen beneath the palace's surface. Rashid did not break the seal on the parchment until the muezzin's final note had drifted away and the courtyard lay in that suspended hush that belonged to the minutes after prayer. The last light of the day fell in long amber shafts through the mashrabiyah screens, scattering across the marble floor in patterns that shifted as the evening breeze moved the hanging lanterns. The study was closed to all but the faint murmur of water from the nearby fountain. A thin coil of smoke rose from the oud burner on the low table, its scent curling through the air, deep, resinous, and steady, as if it were guarding the moment from intrusion. The parchment was smaller than his palm, folded twice. He opened it with the care of a man who understood that the act of reading could be as dangerous as the message itself. The words, written in a hand that leaned slightly to the left, were few. Two in the ministry are willing to speak, but not here. Below the line, in the lower right corner, was the crescent moon, the same mark as before, but drawn smaller, almost hesitant, as though it did not wish to call more attention than the words already had. Rashid's gaze lingered on the ink, absorbing the possible meanings behind the choice of brevity. He read the line again, not for its surface meaning but for the gaps it left, the risks it implied, the doors it hinted could be opened if approached in the right way. Then, without any change in his expression, he slid the note between the pages of a worn volume on the lineage of the Kareem family, the paper vanishing into the shadows of old bindings and dust. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the dala on the table, watching the steam rise in a slow curl. The room was still, but his mind had already begun mapping the steps ahead, not the obvious moves that would draw attention, but the subtle ones, the ones that worked quietly until the moment they became impossible to undo. Noor's evening unfolded in the quiet isolation that had become her routine. The servants' hall where she now took her meals was narrow, its walls bare, its windows small enough that only a pale ribbon of twilight entered. The air always smelled faintly of soap and damp linen from the adjoining laundry, and the simple wooden table bore the faint scars of decades of use. Her tray that night held the expected, flatbread still warm from the griddle, a small dish of spiced lentils, and a bowl of dates. She uncovered it without much thought, until she saw the thin edge of paper tucked beneath the bread, as if it had been placed there in haste, or perhaps with deliberate care to avoid detection. She glanced once toward the doorway. It was empty. The only sound was the muffled clink of dishes from somewhere beyond the corridor. With measured hands, she slid the note free and unfolded it. The handwriting was small but decisive. You will be called again tomorrow. Speak only what you must. Someone watches who believes you. She read it twice, letting the meaning settle into her mind. Each word deliberate, chosen. There was no name, no signature, no mark of the crescent moon this time, only the certainty that it had reached her without interception. She folded it along the same creases, tucking it into the seam of her sleeve where the fabric lay doubled. Her heart had quickened, but her face remained composed as she took a bite of the bread, the gesture as unremarkable as any other evening meal. If anyone entered, they would find her in the same position as always, head slightly lowered, shoulders relaxed, the picture of quiet compliance. By morning, the ministry's rhythm had shifted. The inspectors' movements were no longer confined to predictable routes. They appeared in places they had not visited before, stepping into conversations without warning, calling for attendants who had not yet been questioned. It was a subtle tactic meant to spread unease, to remind the palace that this was not a process to be managed, but an intrusion to be endured. Yet the balance altered when an unannounced visitor arrived at the bronze gates just before noon. His name was Khaled ibn Murad, a distant cousin of the ruling family in Doha, and his reputation moved ahead of him, a man whose hand in political settlements was as steady as it was rarely seen. His retinue was small, almost modest, but the simplicity of his entrance made the fact of it more pronounced. A man of his standing did not travel here without cause. From the balcony above the courtyard, Rashid stood with one hand resting on the carved stone rail, watching Khaled cross the sunlit expanse. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange that carried neither smile nor greeting, but the unmistakable acknowledgement of shared purpose. The inspectors stationed nearby saw it as well. Their glances toward one another were swift, but telling. By late afternoon, the whispers had changed shape. In the servants' hall, talk of Noor's certain guilt softened into speculation. In the market beyond the palace gates, merchants began to say Rashid's name with a kind of measured interest, as if gauging whether the wind was turning. The guards at the main entrance, who had once spoken only of the ministry's authority, now discussed the possibility of a council convened in private chambers, away from the inspector's reach. Somewhere within the ministry's own network, in a room without windows and with a single lamp casting its glow across the bare table, two men waited for a signal they did not yet have permission to send. Their decision, to speak or to remain silent, balanced on forces shifting far beyond the confines of that room, yet drawing steadily closer. The meeting had been fixed for the hour before dawn, that fragile time when the palace's courtyards lay still, the gardens silent except for the soft rustle of leaves in the desert breeze, and the city beyond the walls was no more than a muted silhouette beneath the lingering shroud of night. Rashid moved through the eastern arch with measured steps, the folds of his bisht drawn close around him, the fabric catching faint glimmers from the lanterns still burning low along the colonnade. The marble beneath his sandals was cold, its surface holding the memory of the night. Two guards followed at a respectful distance, their footfalls almost in unison, but he halted them with a single raised hand as they reached the narrow path that wound toward the outer gardens. Beyond that point, shadows were not just concealment, but territory, a place where visibility was dangerous, where one was safer not to be seen at all. The meeting place was an old guest house on the palace's edge, built for the quiet hosting of visitors whose presence was not meant to be public. The heavy wooden door bore the faded carvings of vines and crescents, its once deep colors worn pale by years of sun. Rashid paused a moment before entering, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper dark within. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and dust, and a thin draft moved through the space as if the walls themselves exhaled after years of silence. Two men sat at the low table, their posture deliberate, their robes plain yet immaculate. Rashid knew them by name, though their presence in his company would be denied by both if ever questioned. Faiz al-Hamadi, a mid-tier ministry advisor, was a man whose written reports carried more weight than those of many who outranked him. His skill was in precision, never too much detail to incriminate himself, never too little to be dismissed. Majid Rahman, seated to Fares's right, was quieter. His influence spread through familial ties that reached into the courts of multiple Gulf capitals. Between them, the table held a brass dalla of coffee, still steaming, and 3 small cups placed in silent acknowledgement that the guest would serve himself. Rashid did exactly that, pouring without haste, the sound of liquid meeting porcelain filling the pause before any words were spoken. "They intend to close this within 3 days, Fares said, his voice pitched just above the soft crackle of the oil lamp. Rashid's gaze was steady. Majid shifted slightly, the shadows moving across his face. "The truth is irrelevant when the council believes a single servant's removal will silence the noise." Elsewhere in the palace, Noor stood awake in her narrow room, the stone floor cool under her bare feet. She had risen before the first sounds of the morning, before the clink of trays, before the shuffle of footsteps in the servants' hall. From her window, the outer gardens were just visible, their outlines blurred in the soft gray of pre-dawn. Somewhere beyond them, movements were unfolding that she could not see, yet could feel in the subtle change in the air. The note from the night before remained tucked in the seam of her sleeve, the fabric folding over it like a second layer of skin. She touched it briefly, not out of fear it would be lost, but as if to confirm that its presence, and the knowledge it carried, was still hers. The words had lodged themselves in her mind, not as comfort, but as proof that she had not been entirely abandoned to the mercy of the ministry's designs. Outside her door, footsteps slowed as they passed, and voices dropped in volume. She could not hear the words, but the tone was enough, cautious, guarded, as though carrying messages that were not meant to be spoken too near her. In the guest house, the conversation moved from what the ministry intended to how it might be undone. Fares spoke of names, the ones who would argue most fiercely for her removal, the ones who might be swayed with the right words, and the ones who would bend only under pressure unseen. Majid outlined the lines of loyalty, the quiet debts owed, the alliances that could be revived if approached through the proper channels. Rashid listened without interruption, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of his untouched cup. When they had finished, he leaned back slightly, the folds of his bisht settling around him like a shadow. "This is not about a servant," he said at last. "It is about precedent. If they can set it here, in my own house, they will know they can bend the family itself." Neither man disagreed. The lamp flame wavered in the still air, casting long, shifting shadows on the carved panels of the wall. The weight of what had been spoken hung between them, not as something to be debated, but as something already decided. Rashid rose, offering a brief nod that carried more gratitude than the moment allowed to be voiced. When he stepped back into the night, the first pale threads of dawn were already weaving through the darkness, touching the tops of the palm fronds with gold. Somewhere inside the palace, the formal day would soon begin, but the real work, the work that would determine its outcome, was already in motion. The morning carried a strange weight, the kind that presses into the skin without announcing its cause. In the ministry's temporary offices within the palace's north wing, the air felt taut, heavy with an awareness that had not been there the day before. The inspectors arrived at their usual hour, yet even the rhythm of their steps sounded altered, less leisurely, more contained, as if they were walking in formation toward an enemy they had not expected to face. They spoke less, their voices low, their movements sharpened by the faint stiffness of men who had been briefed in private. Orders were issued with clipped efficiency, the retrieval of records unrelated to the fountain incident, the sudden interest in files belonging to servants who had not so much as stepped into the inner courtyard. Messengers were dispatched to parts of the palace where their authority had once been unquestioned, but now their presence drew watchful eyes from behind carved doors and latticed windows. In the central courtyard, their patrols became more deliberate, almost performative. The sound of their boots on stone was steady, measured, a sound meant to be noticed, meant to remind anyone watching that the ministry's reach still extended here. From the balcony above, Rashid stood in the shadow of an archway, his hands resting lightly on the carved balustrade. He did not move, and yet his presence seemed to draw the morning's light toward him, catching in the gold embroidery of his bisht. His eyes tracked the inspectors without expression, but in the stillness of his stance, there was a quiet authority, a statement that he saw them, that he understood the game they were playing, and that he had no intention of conceding the board. Noor felt the change in subtler ways. In the kitchens, the atmosphere was no longer saturated with the easy malice of whispered certainty. The looks directed at her had shifted, not softened but tempered by calculation, as though each person weighing her fate now also weighed the risk of being wrong. Conversations that once ended abruptly at her entrance now continued haltingly, the speakers measuring each phrase, their eyes flicking toward her before returning to their work. When she crossed the colonnade to fetch water from the inner garden, she noticed 2 guards she had never seen before posted at the far archway. Their posture was disciplined, their eyes scanning the length of the path with a soldier's vigilance. She could not tell whether they had been stationed for her protection or to keep her contained within the boundaries assigned to her. The question followed her as she knelt by the fountain, the brass jug in her hands dipping beneath the surface. The water's ripples bent her reflection into shifting patterns, her face stretching and contracting with each movement, as if even her own image could not decide who she was in the eyes of the palace. By midday, whispers moved faster than the heat. Khalid ibn Murad's presence in the palace had become the subject of speculation far beyond its walls. In the markets, merchants leaned across their stalls to speak in lowered voices about the questions his envoys were asking. Not about trade or family ties, but about allegiances, about debts owed and favors quietly exchanged. Inside the council wing, a meeting was called behind doors of carved teak, the kind of doors that shut with the finality of stone. No aides were admitted. Only those with the authority to alter the direction of events were allowed inside. The discussion within could not be heard, but its effects were visible in the way certain faces emerged afterward, some tight with concern, others sharpened with the satisfaction of opportunity. For the first time since the ministry's arrival, it was clear that the palace was pressing back, its weight no longer passive, but deliberate. Night brought with it the low, restless breath of the desert wind, moving through the palm fronds and setting the lanterns in the courtyard swaying in slow arcs. Rashid was in his study when the message came, slipped silently beneath the door. The parchment was plain, the handwriting the same precise script as before. They have shortened their timeline. One day remains. Beneath the words, the crescent moon had been inked darker than before, its curve thicker, as if to anchor the warning in permanence. He read it once, then set it beside the brass lamp, its flame catching along the edge of the page. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, the distant hum of the palace fading into something more like the heartbeat of the place itself, slow, steady, inevitable. In her chamber, Noor lay on her narrow bed, eyes open to the dark. The stone walls held the day's heat, releasing it slowly so that the air felt almost close, almost watching. Beyond her door, footsteps passed, paused, and moved on. She could not tell if they belonged to a guard, a servant, or someone sent to listen. Somewhere in the palace, threads were being drawn tighter. The feeling reached her like the change in the air before a storm, invisible but undeniable. The confrontation ahead was no longer an abstract possibility. It had taken form, and it was moving toward her.